UNESCO is the United Nations educational, scientific, and cultural organization. It distinguished itself in the 80s by becoming the leading UN organization for sort of most notorious for corruption, anti-Americanism, et cetera, attempts to gag free speech. President Reagan pulled the US out. We stayed out for almost 20 years. In 2003, trying to make nice to the United Nations after September 11th and with the invasion of Iraq ahead, President Bush, too, returned the US to UNESCO, where we are still today. But here's how UNESCO has distinguished itself recently. You probably have seen this, you're probably familiar with the basic tale, but let me just give you in brief. Last fall, when the Palestinian Authority made its run for full membership at the United Nations, was turned down. The Security Council said no. The US basically said no, after leaving it kind of hanging for months. The Palestinian Authority then went to UNESCO. And at UNESCO's General Conference, which is held every 2 years and was held last October, November in Paris at its headquarters, UNESCO voted resoundingly to admit the Palestinian Authority. Their General Conference voted 107 to 14, with 52 abstaining, and a few dozen more presumably out to lunch. This was over U.S. objections, over U.S. nominal objections, and the Palestinian Authority became, for the first time, a full member of a UN organization. This opens the door to Palestinian membership in a number of other UN organizations. And if nothing is done, this opens the door to a complete end run around US policy that the Palestinians should negotiate a real peace directly with Israel before they get statehood at the UN. It also opens the door to a precedent at the UN itself, which could become quite alarming, and that is the idea that instead of having to go to get the recommendation of the Security Council for the vote of the General Assembly to become a member state, you can do an end run by going to the multitude of organizations, agencies, and so on, and asking their General Assemblies to vote and admit you. Okay, that happened last fall. That triggered a law that was passed and then amended in the 1990s in the United States, which forbids funding to any part of the United Nations that admits the Palestinians before they have fulfilled the US conditions. That meant that the Obama administration, which actually didn't want to on the evidence, really had no choice but to withdraw American funding for UNESCO, which comes to roughly $78 million a year for the core budget. 22% of UNESCO's funding has been coming from the US, plus millions more in extra budgetary doodads. Okay, that sets our stage. Now the story. What has UNESCO done about this? UNESCO's current current Director General, is a Bulgarian woman named Irina Bokova. She was elected in 2009. The US was thrilled with the decision because the rival candidate was Egypt's Minister of Culture, an anti-Semitic who favored burning Semitic fellow who favored burning Israeli books. Okay, Irina Bokova did not begin her career in a glow of good governance. She was trained in Moscow at MGIMO, which traditionally turned out, I have no idea whether she was enrolled in this particular aspect of it, but that was the spook school in Moscow for the overseas service. She began her UN career at the Bulgarian mission in New York in the early 80s during the Cold War, and proceeded on to become, as the world changed, a politician, et cetera. Anyway, she is now the head of UNESCO. Her response when UNESCO's General Conference voted to admit the Palestinians was to welcome the Palestinians and then to regret, to say the only thing she was terribly sorry about was not that UNESCO had stuck its thumb in America's eye, had taken a decision to admit the Palestinian Authority, which has on its logo at its UN observer mission a map of the Middle East on which Israel has been annihilated. Ms. Bokova's reaction was to start lobbying the United States to overturn its own law and resume sending the money. This isn't just lobbying from Paris. In December, shortly after this meeting, she came to Washington and met with lawmakers, explaining to them that it is in the interests of the United States to resume funding UNESCO, even if that means that in order to do this for UNESCO, America has to scrap its own law, okay? But that was just the opening act. She then appointed quietly a Washington liaison. There's actually nothing in the UNESCO budget at the moment. There is no job description. There's no official anything, but this fellow does carry a business card, I have it, that says Washington Liaison. The liaison she picked is a former communications director for our very own Representative Nancy Pelosi, who worked for Representative Pelosi in the late 90s and has been working for UNESCO since 2007. His name is George Papagiannis. He's a energetic fellow. He sent a set of talking points around to UNESCO supporters in the US a few weeks ago in advance of the Director General's next trip to the United States, her second trip in 4 months, her third trip in 7 months, because she'd actually come through before the vote to meeting with policy types in Washington to see if this law could be overturned, anticipating that the Palestinians would be admitted. Okay, these talking points are run around. A copy came to me. They were just fascinating. They weren't meant to come to me. And I called George Papagiannis to ask what was going on. Since UNESCO has no liaison office in Washington, they do have a well-staffed liaison office with at least a dozen people in New York at UN headquarters. Anyway, what then unfolded was the Director General came to the United States for a 12-week roadshow that opened in Washington with a lunch at the UN Foundation, proceeded to Philadelphia, Miami, Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. And as this began, this amazing propaganda campaign swung into motion. I have to credit George Papagiannis. We train them well on Capitol Hill. One of the first things to come out was a piece on Comedy Central, not a hard news reporting outlet, but an outlet watched by an enormous number of people. And satire is very effective medium when it's well done. And this was a piece just savaging the United States for defunding UNESCO. And the way it went, roughly, with George Papagiannis appearing unnamed on camera as a UNESCO official interviewed by this very funny British comedian named John Oliver, who works for Comedy Central, is, woohoo, what next for American policy? What could be more fun than defunding an organization that helps hungry, needy people all around the world? And there was a whole sort of lampooning the U.S. They interviewed someone presented as a congressman, Congressman Wexler, who actually isn't a congressman anymore, and who was fully in UNESCO's camp, but who posed as an idiot congressman, kind of dumbly repeating, well, we had to do it, our law. And John Oliver mocked him, our outdated law. One of the talking points is that the law is outdated, okay? UNESCO is now determining the shelf life of American laws. The law goes all the way back to 20 years, almost 20 years, beyond living memory, apparently. UNESCO, which spends its time otherwise commemorating ancient, interesting artifacts, would like to see us chop this because it dates back to the 1990s. Actually, it's more relevant than ever today because this is when the Palestinians are actually attempting an end run at the UN, okay? This Comedy Central piece got huge play. It was praised by The Atlantic as the wonderful things you can do with satire. It's been picked up in a series of op-eds, and as Irina Bokova went across the country, it was also like popcorn. This series of op-eds have been blossoming on the horrible things that the U.S. is doing, pulling money for UNESCO, and what kind of crazy thing is this? The policy is mocked as, well, we had no choice but to cut off funding for starving, drought-ridden children in Africa, and so on. Okay. In this same piece, George Papagiannis informed the Comedy Central that even little Gabon, the little West African country of Gabon, had stepped up right after the U.S. decision to pull the vote for the Palestinians and the triggering of the U.S. clause to pull American money. And Gabon had offered $2 million to UNESCO to begin to make up for poor little UNESCO this fund. Well, okay. That's Comedy Central. That's the story that's out there right now. This is the narrative that is being created. George Papagiannis is coming to Washington, as far as I am aware. UNESCO has already been looking for office space. They looked in the Office of American States, where they currently have UNRWA busy. They already have a lobbying section. They call it consciousness raising awareness on K Street. They've been looking for office space for him. My most recent conversation with UNESCO just yesterday was they told me, we're not opening a Washington office. I said, why have you been looking for office space? They said, we're just looking for a place for George to dump his briefcase and his laptop. So if you find George Papagiannis in your closet, that was all they were really looking for. Okay. Meanwhile, as to these talking points, Gabon with its $2 million, Gabon featured large in a Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations report 2 years ago with Senator Carl Levin presiding, bipartisan report, as one of 4 case studies of keeping foreign corruption out of the United States. Gabon used to be the 3rd largest oil producer in Africa. It's now the 6th. It has been ruled by the same Bongo family for more than 40 years. The father died in 2009. The son, who was the defense minister for the father, inherited everything. They are notorious, as Senator Levin correctly said, for having become some of the wealthiest people in the world by plundering their own country and laundering millions in tainted money through United States accounts, as well as acquiring dozens of fancy luxury properties in Paris. That was Little Gabon on Comedy Central that gave $2 million. That was President Bongo, in fact, who offered the check and then delivered a presentation at a UNESCO Leaders Forum on the Gabon model of emerging development and got a seat for Gabon for 4 years on UNESCO's 58-member executive board, which also includes Syria, which UNESCO reaffirmed as a member of its Human Rights Committee for the next 2 years. Okay. This is UNESCO, which has been lobbying all over the United States, Comedy Central, op-eds, former Pelosi staffer. Our current ambassador, the administration is very much in UNESCO's camp, and in fact has been all over Congress to change this. America's current ambassador to UNESCO is a former congressional aide to Representative Tom Lantos, David Killian, who worked on getting the U.S. back into UNESCO and is now the ambassador there. When the Palestinian vote was held, Ambassador Killian's statement in explanation of the vote was to repeat U.S. policy on Palestinian admission, but then to say, we really regret that this has all happened and we intend to continue working to strengthen the marvelous organization that you are, or words to that effect. In other words, as you probably know, the U.S. State Department, when it put out its budget for 2012 and 2013, included a figure for UNESCO of more than $78 million for 2013. If you scroll down 2 pages to the fine italic footnote, it said the administration intends to work with Congress for some way around the law that prohibits funding. So it's right there in the budget. They're planning to tell Congress that it needs to get rid of the law because UNESCO wants the money. This has been going on everywhere I look. When Irina Bokova, the head of UNESCO, was here in this road show that just ended last week, among the places she went was Philadelphia, where she gave a presentation at Independence Hall, which is a UNESCO landmark site. The Secretary of the Interior, Ken Salazar, hailed her arrival with an op-ed in the Philadelphia, what's it called? Inquirer, thank you, exactly. And went to join her on the steps of Independence Hall, apparently oblivious to the enormous irony. This is the birthplace of the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution, where our framework of laws was created. She was here specifically. I can't call it lobbying since it's consciousness raising, but she was here to lobby the United States to overturn its law to please UNESCO. As to the talking points that are out there, just to wrap this up quickly, the things that UNESCO has been putting out is it works on tsunami warning, it works on literacy programs, all these things that sound wonderful. Well, if you actually look at the structure of UNESCO, it's sort of a million points of mooch. This is an organization that puts its label on projects where usually the national authorities do the heavy lifting. And by that I mean usually the United States in a lot of their projects. We paid 22% of their budget. That's why it is so interesting that the Director General of UNESCO in the past 7 months has been here 3 times to try and persuade us that we need to dump our own law. Tsunami warning, again, they've had for years and years. They hadn't quite reached the point of producing something that warned anybody about the 2004 tsunami. That's now of interest, okay, but little after the fact. They have a Caribbean tsunami warning system. If you actually look into it, that's mostly the United States and other national authorities, and UNESCO sort of serves as a coordinating mechanism. There's no reason it couldn't be replaced by a local group, by another UN agency, et cetera. Likewise, literacy, the climate education that they engage in, whatever your views on climate education, is something that duplicates things already being done by about a dozen UN climate agencies as well as the UN Development Program. Many scandals residing there, but even if you think they're fine, there's no reason UNESCO needs to do this. And then we get to my favorite. I mean, there's so many parts of this. Yeah. My favorite, I'll wrap this up with, Holocaust education, because this is beyond ironic. One of the big points that Ms. Bokova and George Papagiannis have been talking up to the press is that UNESCO runs a project on Holocaust education, and it's the only UN agency that does so. This is supposed to be vital. Well, I was curious because I haven't actually seen a lot of evidence of any Holocaust education program coming from UNESCO. So for the past 2 weeks, I've been slogging away trying to get answers from UNESCO. I now have them. I'll have a piece out this evening, I think. If anyone would like to give me a card and an address, I'm happy to send it to you. It will give a lot of the details and then some. Their Holocaust education project, which has been the subject of newspaper articles here, the reason that we can't let UNESCO go, this is so important. If you actually dig into it, consists of one, count him, one full-time employee in Paris who was hired only last year. And his salary is paid entirely by Israel. And the money he has available for projects is the result of a fund which over the past 4 years has collected $536,000, most of that from Israel, some of it from the United States, about 200,000. And UNESCO's total contribution from its own budget, that would be its $326 million or more a year budget, to which the U.S. has been contributing $78 million a year. They're telling us they can't proceed with Holocaust education without it. UNESCO's total contribution from its own budget to Holocaust education comes this year to $215,000, period. 215,000. That's it. That is the Holocaust education project. That's what they're investing. That's what they're telling us. We now need to overturn our law in order to allow the money to flow, in order to allow this project to go forward. And I'll just add on that one, how very ironic, again, that this is one of the poster projects to persuade us, coming from the organization that just admitted the Palestinian Authority, on whose UN observer logo Israel has been wiped off the face of the earth.